Good day and welcome to Out of the Trenches, where I sit here in my chair of wisdom and answer all of your questions about the First World War. Hi guys, love the show. My question for Out of the Trenches is, did whole units introduce camouflage patterns that the men had to wear on their uniforms, or was it entirely reliant on the environment? Or did individual soldiers customize their uniforms however they wanted to personally? This also extends to armored or air units. Did they introduce standard camo, or would pilots or tank crews paint their vehicles however they wanted? The process of camouflaging troops became systematic during the First World War, as it became increasingly important to conceal soldiers from the gaze of enemy pilots. This was especially the case for guns and vehicles, as both sides did not want to reveal, the amount of firepower they each possessed. Tanks and artillery pieces were painted with bold, contrasting colors to obscure their outlines, like with the dazzled camouflage ships, which we've talked about before. In terms of the troops themselves, maybe the most famous transition to camouflage took place within the French army, when the high command decided to switch from the traditional red pantaloons and blue coats to the grayish-blue uniforms that did not present as much of an obvious target to the Germans. The Germans issued the first standardized camouflage painted equipment, with their helmets painted with the disruptive camouflage patterns known as Buntfarbenanstrich. These were given to the elite stormtrooper and artillery crew members. Neither side wore the camouflage that we see on modern soldiers today, because the technology required to print such patterns on fabric did not exist yet. Although some British snipers did take matters into their own hands and paint their tunics in the colors of the local terrain to help conceal themselves. Pilots probably had the greatest degree of freedom as to how they wished to camouflage their aircraft. The French were the first to use camouflage on their fighters by painting on irregular patches of green and brown. The Germans copied this idea, but later abandoned it after a series of friendly fire incidents. They later used camouflage on their planes to avoid being seen from above by other enemy aircraft. Pilots would choose which colors they wanted for their camouflage so they could remain distinct from other pilots. The British used an olive color above the wings and a creamy color underneath, which was not actually intended as camouflage, but to protect the plane from the sun's ultraviolet rays. It was, however, also an effective camouflage. What was adopted rather quickly was, in fact, camouflage during winter, which I guess seems kind of obvious. Snipers, sentries, and scouts were equipped with white overcoats to blend in with the snow, the white environment. Engineer writes, "Howdy from the great state of Texas, Indian crew." Well, howdy back. I've been wondering, what were funerary practices like at the front? Were there anything like official ceremonies, or was there just simply no time to mourn the loss of comrades in arms? The sheer scale of the killing during the war was entirely unprecedented, and the deaths were horrific. Since artillery was, as we've said before, the biggest killer of the war, many men were simply blown to pieces, and there was nothing left to bury. Excessive mourning for dead comrades was not encouraged, as it distracted soldiers from the task at hand. The best way to survive and cope in the trenches was to suppress all grief. The organization of the PALS battalions, however, had a deeper effect on those who lost comrades, since they had probably grown up with the very men they had just seen killed or blown to pieces. So it's not hard to understand why so many men broke down from shell shock or suffered other, perhaps hidden mental disorders after the war. The burials that did take place varied depending on the circumstances of death. Before the First World War, those killed in conflict were often dumped in a mass grave that was marked out afterwards. However, the unique circumstances of the Great War caused this to change. Many soldiers were buried where they died, if it was possible, to prevent disease from spreading in the cramped conditions of the trenches. Burying someone as quickly as possible was also another way to try to stem the growth of the local rat population, who really liked to eat the flesh of the dead. A simple cross or marker of some sort would often be left, often without a name, to show that a body was buried there. The bodies of those who were dealt with by the enemy were often piled into mass graves since it's impossible for enemy authorities to know who they were. Most of the bodies in no man's land couldn't be reached, and their remains were eventually just consumed by the landscape. Soldiers would often accidentally dig up decomposing corpses in their trenches. The dead going unburied also, as you can imagine, had a really bad smell, especially in the heat of the summer sun. Many bodies are still being discovered to this day. All the armies employed chaplains or holy men of their various religions who took on the sorrows of the soldiers as best as possible. The time of grief, though, often came after combat, when soldiers were relieved from the front lines and, they were in the rear and had time to reflect and think on their losses. That was also often the time when they heard of fallen comrades from other units. So writing home, religious rituals, or just talking to your comrades was pretty much the only way to really deal with it. Hartvig writes, were there any prisoner exchanges during World War I? And I get mine, you get yours. Oh, okay, that kind of thing. Prisoner exchanges were very rare, but they did sometimes take place. Usually seriously wounded prisoners who would clearly never be able to take up arms again for their country were sometimes sent back home rather than being further detained. In addition to this, soldiers of a certain age, those who had spent a lengthy period in captivity, and men who were suffering from mental disorders could also qualify for the exchange. Those exchanges were usually done through neutral countries like Switzerland or the Netherlands. We did a whole special about stormtroops, and if you'd like to check that out, you can click right here for that. And you should also check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for all your dreams to come true. See you next time.